and welcome to Podworld, a podcast about the podcasts that you should be listening to. I'm Louise Blaine.
And I'm David Mar Roberts, or DMR. Welcome back, podcast fans.
So if you haven't listened to Podworld before, welcome. It's lovely to see you, hear you, be in your existence, be in your ears. Basically, every episode of Podworld, we feature a specific podcast genre. And we pick 4 very different podcasts from that genre. We talk about them. We've listened to quite a few episodes, a lot of episodes in some cases, years of episodes in some cases. And then we interview a podcast creator from the same genre. And then at the end, we add in some little extra recommendations that we've got. And we add some listener recommendations as well. So that's how Podworld works.
And today we're looking for podcasts that inspire us, that look for solutions to really, really big problems. So we're looking for podcasts that make the world a better place, and we pick out the ones that we think you should listen to. And later in the show, Louise has a chat with the host of the GlobalGoalsCast, Edie Lush.
But before we start, we'd really appreciate it if you could follow us on social, and I'd also appreciate if you would follow us on your podcast platform of choice. So if you hit that follow button, if you hit that subscribe button, you'll get a notification when our new episode arrives, which is always a nice thing. And if you like what you hear, and we really hope you do, please take the seconds it takes to pop a review on, and then we get to climb the charts faster, and then we get to make more Podworld. But without further ado, I've stopped asking questions of you. Let's get started with the show.
So this was a really interesting topic to go hunting for podcasts, because on the surface, there seems to be lots of inspirational podcasts that kind of, the people talk about the problems and they think they have the solutions, but they seem, in my ears, they seem to be mainly discussing the problems. There were a lot fewer podcasts that actually found or would discuss the solutions and bringing in different voices and experts. And for me, to make that sort of inspirational podcast of, something that can potentially help to change the world or make the world a better place, it needs to have that combination of identifying the problem, proposing the solutions, getting different voices, but also being entertaining. Quite difficult. I wonder what you found on your search.
It's really interesting. Trying to make the world a better place is a wonderful thing to say. But one of the podcasts that I listen to, and I'll talk about in a minute, has an interview with Barack Obama, ex-President Barack Obama. And he says that the problem with being president is that you sit down and suddenly you realize that all the problems that could have been solved by previous presidents. And all that you've got left is the really hard stuff that no one's solved yet. And that's basically the situation we're in with the world. We have a world of challenges. We have a world of climate change, and we have a world where we really need to do things. But actually, it's now really, really difficult. And so that means it's okay for us to listen to podcasts that maybe don't specifically have the answer, but are talking about the problem. And they're talking about the problem in an active way. They're using researchers and politicians and creative people trying to fix the problems that we have. Because if it was easy, we'd have done it already. So here are 4 amazing podcasts to make the world a better place. Or at least try.
So my first recommendation is a podcast called Reasons to be Cheerful.
This is Reasons to be Cheerful with Ed Miliband and Jeff Lloyd.
Well, hello.
Hello, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm fine. I had a wonderful moment in the street the other day.
Go on.
We found on the pavement a cuddly toy of one of the mascots from the 2012 Olympic Games. Do you remember the 2 mascots, Wenlock and Vanderbilt?
Wow. I think it might be quite valuable.
I've been listening to it for, I think, about 3 years, the last 3 years. It's a podcast put together by Jeff Lloyd, who's a BBC Radio 5 presenter and journalist, and Ed Miliband, the ex-leader of the Labour Party here in the UK. It started off the back of the 2016 referendum, and it was very much an antidote to the negative discourse that continued through 2016 until, well...
Still here.
Still here. And I know Ed Miliband was a Remainer, and he was very much, trying to to combat the whole Brexit thing. But instead, he decided smartly to get involved with this podcast and actually tackle some of the major issues of our time. And as you say, Lou, the really difficult ones, because all the easy ones have been solved. So, you know, this is climate change, inequality, poverty, transport in the 21st century, or house building, universal basic income, AI and technology taking over jobs, all of that kind of stuff. The way they work this podcast is they bring in 2 or 3 experts to talk about the solutions that already exist to these kind of problems. And these might be solutions in different countries. They might actually be research-based solutions from universities. And what I love about it is practical, and it is steeped in research and data and science. The most recent episodes, just to give you a little bit of a taste, they've talked about the future of the workplace, for example. You know, for the last 12 months, a lot of us have been working from home. Or there's the whole thing about moving from an economy where we grew up, which was an economy of owning things, to an economy of just using things and therefore just paying to use them, paying to rent. A very different model. How does that change? These are really big issues. So each episode starts with the 2 of them talking about the reasons to be cheerful. And that's very personal. You know, Ed goes cold water swimming at the moment, so he talks about that. And they end with a cheerful guest who's usually a comedian and who comes along with a list of reasons why they're cheerful. So there is very much those sort of 2 bookends. But in between, there's also the reason to be cheerful, which is there are solutions to some of these big problems. And for me, the reason this podcast is so good is that they manage to address serious topics from really varied parts of our life. And this is sort of policy government type stuff. So it could be quite dry. But actually, by bringing these different voices from around the world, you know, I think they had the Prime Minister from Iceland, you know, people like that, because Ed obviously has some pull power for sort of A-list guests in politics. And also it's then backed up by research and data. So that combination is great. But they balance all of that with a really sort of goofy sense of humor. And there's a really endearing relationship between the 2 of them. And Ed is super smart as a politician, but he does come across, as we remember from the bacon sandwich episode during the election.
Bacon sandwich gate, dear me.
He can come across as a little bit goofy and a little bit geeky.
Yeah.
In terms of a podcast that tries to make the world a better place, because of the practical solutions they bring to every episode, I think they do a great job.
This is my confession. I didn't get a chance to listen to Reasons to be Cheerful because, as you'll find out, I was mainlining, trying to plug into as many other podcasts as possible.
Oh gosh, the amount of podcasts we listen to, it's crazy. So what's your first recommendation, Lou?
So I think it's really interesting, the fact that we're talking about all of the things that we're now left with, which is gender inequality, racial inequality, trans inequality. We're faced with a whole lot of really big issues where people aren't getting to be the person that they should be because of other people's thoughts and oppression and all of these things. So, but all of this kind of boils down to who we are as humans, right? That it's, if we can work out how we human, if we can work out how to human at our best, then maybe we can help everything else. And I've been listening to an amazing podcaster and author and university researcher called Brené Brown. And she's done a podcast, which is one of many, but it's called Unlocking Us.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brené Brown. Welcome to the Unlocking Us podcast. 12 years ago, I bought a used microphone. I hooked it up to my laptop and recorded a podcast on empathy and shame. It was very DIY from my kitchen table, but I fell in love with podcasting. It was intimate, raw, and most importantly, it gave me a way to connect directly with you. Well, here it is a dozen years later, and I'm coming back with Unlocking Us. I've given a lot of thought to how I want to spend this next decade. And one thing I know for sure is that I want to have more meaningful conversations that help us unlock the deeply human part of who we are.
She's one of these amazing people that has their brain everywhere and you can always listen to her, but she really digs deep into empathy and understanding. And she's when I listen to her, I think she's a bit like sitting down with the best possible therapist, but also that teacher that made the hour go really, really fast. That's how I kind of feel when I listen to her. Like she's just this really passionate, empathetic, intelligent person. And so in each episode of Unlocking Us, she dives into not even a specific topic. She just interviews someone about their life and how they do what they do. And one of the interviews was with President Barack Obama about his new book. I mean, she has serious, in terms, she's like A-list podcaster. I mean, I also listen to her podcast with Melinda Gates, for instance, who she's obviously written books with and been friends with. So she's one of these total high flyers, but not in that really irritating way, just in a, how did you get so smart way. So what I find especially enjoyable about her is that she's not afraid to say that people are affecting her. You know, she'll say, I'm a better person for reading your book or listening to this thing you did. It's quite alien to British people to be so effusive and to be so passionate and to actually tell people what they makes you feel. You know, that's not what we do. She does that, and not in a sort of horrible, oh, you're just bootlicking way, just a really impassioned and exceptionally emotionally intelligent way. So listening to her, she did an amazing interview with queer Puerto Rican comic writer Gabby Rivera that I just was beaming throughout, because she brings out the most incredible, relatable side to people, and it becomes very emotionally honest. I found it really, really inspiring. So what it is to be human is everything, and I think Unlocking Us can cover that. And she also does a podcast called Dare to Lead, which is about leadership, which actually is just about being a better human in your life, in management positions, in work, but also just generally in being with the family. And she kind of talks about relationships, and especially how the COVID pandemic has really affected things for her and her husband and her family. And all of these things are things that she discusses with her podcast interviewees as well. So it's really interesting, and I didn't expect to be so pulled in and to feel like my brain was actively getting bigger as someone talked about the small things, which are the things that we should really appreciate. And there's also a couple of episodes where she just kind of speaks, and she just has this like flow of consciousness, which she then fills with really interesting stuff. So she did a podcast episode about how our brains can actually get really tired, because it turns out that we tend to think of our brains as kind of infinite, and they're not. Our brains actually get really exhausted. Our brains get tired. And someone was talking about, she'd been watching The Queen's Gambit, that Anya Taylor-Joy chess Netflix thing.
Yeah, I love that.
From there, she springboarded into the idea of brains and how they work. And it turns out that she then called up her friend who was a researcher at the University of Stanford and said, hey, how do brains work? And he literally sent her this audio file that was just like, well, it turns out that your brain, when you're like chess masters, they actually use the same amount of energy as Olympic athletes.
Wow.
Because they're so focused. So our brains can get tired. So it's just the little things like that she totally dives into and gives time to, and platforms, the little ideas. Yeah, her podcast has actually really affected me in a way that I didn't expect it to at all.
I listened to one episode which was about inclusivity at work, which was really important to me, because we've been at Dialect, the business that I run, we've been looking at that over the last 9 months in a real focus. And what I loved about her episode and the people she talked to was actually understanding the difference between having an action plan for inclusivity at work and what it means, and making it more like transactional. We need to do this, 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 and this, versus transformational, which is talking to everybody, understanding what it means to them, what inclusivity means to them, and actually making that part of the plan. And the difference between those two approaches was really revelatory for me. So that really, really got me thinking. And within this whole theme that we have today about, podcasts that help or try to make the world a better place, it's not all about solving climate change. It's actually these difficult things that we're dealing with. How can we actually approach these and make a difference? And this one episode already had a massive impact, and I'll be bringing that to the team as soon as possible.
That's amazing. Actually, if you do listen to any of the podcasts that we recommend and it changes something for you, let us know it. Tell us the episode. Tell us what changed, and we can talk about that and share it, because that's what's really exciting about these things, that they can change us in really interesting ways.
Absolutely.
But what's next from you?
So on that theme, the next one for me is called Mothers of Invention.
Maeve, what on earth are you doing to that cabbage?
Oh, I just can't take it, Mary. These headlines are just too much.
Why are you taking it out on that poor vegetable?
Well, I thought it might be able to absorb my pain, before I cook it and nourish myself with its vitamins and folate and what have you. Ugh.
I screamed into a bag of okra after Donald Trump was elected. It tasted the same and made me feel a whole lot better.
Well, I'm very impressed with your commitments to both vegetable intake and self-care. But also, this isn't how we get things done, girls.
This is quite an incredible podcast because I find a lot of podcasts are generational. You've got the host of a certain age and the audience will, not be all of that age, but it will sort of be within that generational environment. So Gen Z podcasters will have a Gen Z audience and et cetera, et cetera. So this one is quite incredible because it's hosted by Mary Robinson, who's the ex-Irish president, and an Irish comedian called Maeve Higgins. And there's also, the producer is Tamale Kodikara, and she's also a co-host on there. These three women have created a really uplifting podcast, and it's all about celebrating amazing women that do remarkable things, mainly in pursuit of climate justice. Their premise, which I like, is climate change is a man-made problem with a feminist solution. And they basically go talking to a wide variety of women of different ages, lots of marginalized voices, and they feature lots and lots of Gen Z guests, which is very, very cool. And it shows that there's this whole cross-generational approach, which means the audience, you'll find people coming in, like my daughter, Ella, will come in and she's 21 and she finds this incredible. And me in my 50s will also find it really, really inspiring because we identify with different people within that conversation. There's great light-hearted approaches to the conversation, but also they dig very, very deep into some of the big issues around the climate crisis. I think in this current season, they have a new feature, which is a soundscape from a listener, which is really so lovely, kind of zooms into a specific listener's environment. And it's a real nice pause in the podcast, a cherished moment to listen to nature and allow you to focus a little bit on why we need to save the climate, which kind of reminds me of what we talked about in our last episode about nature and connecting to nature.
I really enjoyed Mothers of Invention. I only listened to a couple of episodes, but there was one on biodiversity, which was fascinating. And what I especially like is I really love the interactions between the three of them because they're all very, very different. And there's just this wonderful tone, and it's they're very, very clever people, but I think there's this great sort of friendliness to it where you feel like you are going on a journey with them. So I think it's an incredible podcast that I think that's one thing to say about these. I previously, other than what I'm about to talk about next, I'd never really thought about listening to podcasts like this. And I genuinely, my brain is, I feel like I've had air pumped into my brain, not empty air, like actual nutritious. My brain is bigger. It's been fed from all these podcasts, which sounds really, really ridiculous and absurd. But actually, I genuinely feel properly enriched, DMR, properly enriched.
I totally agree. And speaking of podcasts that enrich us, I think your next choice is a phenomenal example of this.
Okay, so I'm going big. Why go small? Why just pick one podcast when you can pick them all, right? So I'm going to talk about TED Talks. Now, before I get into the individual podcasts that are available with TED Talks, we always talk about TED Talks and we say, if you say something for ages, you say, and thanks for coming to my TED Talk. But I think it's important to look at what TED Talks actually are. So we're really used to seeing someone on a stage with a Madonna mic and holding their hands in that really sort of Steve Jobs way, when they look really sincere and they hold their hands. But what is it actually about? So TED stands for Technology, Entertainment and Design, and it's a non-profit organisation basically dedicated to spreading ideas, which are usually in the form of short, sub 20-minute talks. Now, obviously, they've gone longer on that and they go shorter on that, but it's basically about everything. So TED Talks, you could equally have a man standing on a stage making the sound of a brass band with just his mouth, or you could have the genuine, serious question of, are schools killing creativity? You can go from the sublime to the sublime via the completely ridiculous. Like, it's insane. There's a lot out there, but that makes it a great fit for podcasts, because obviously if it's short form and you can fire it into your ears and you can have it while you're on the train or doing something, that's a really good way to consume media. So amidst all of that, and I became immediately overwhelmed. So I used to listen to a lot of TED Talks, and I would watch TED Talks. I really like the TED app that I've got on my smart TV, but I wasn't sure where to start with a podcast. And you actually said you should look at the TED Radio Hour, because it basically brings in a stack of different TED Talks. But I wasn't ready for how good it was. I mean, I would have been ready if they would just drop, 10-minute TED Talk after TED Talk, in for an hour. But that's not what they do. So it's NPR. It's basically, it's an hour-long interview with a thinker or creator or any of these brains about the TED Talks that have affected them and the TED Talks that they have learned things from. So it's presented by Manoush Zomorodi, and she's just this amazing interviewer. She just asks them the most insightful questions. She goes on these lovely journeys, and I listened to the most amazing episode. I mean, I listened to one with a guy called AJ Jacobs, and it's about the art of gratitude. And he has written a book about gratitude, and he's written a book about how he thanked everyone involved with certain things. So he had a cup of coffee and he decided to thank everyone that was involved in the bringing of his cup of coffee, down to the people who made the cups, the people who designed the tops, the people who were the pest control in the factories to stop the coffee being eaten by rats. So he basically rang everyone and said thanks.
Wow.
And now that might sound like one of those bizarre, yes man type ideas, but the episode explored gratitude, and it explored different types of stories and understanding and empathy and understanding that every story has multiple sides to it. So taking the time to recognize these things. And because it then took from specific TED Talks that he'd been inspired by, it was constantly very human. It was constantly about his story and his understanding of what life is. So it was really just this wonderful, big, chewy thinking device in a really nice, palatable sort of wraparound that you never felt like I think the joy of it is you never feel like you're being preached to. It's just someone really exciting is telling you something great. And also on the TED Talk side, if you don't want a whole hour, because sometimes we don't have an hour, TED Talks Daily is really good. And these are all different lengths, and they're full of sort of fascinating people. I listened to a Bill Gates chat on tackling climate change, but also there was sort of constructive discussions about the Paris Agreement and general things. And you can just kind of dip in. You just go, oh, that sounds interesting. And it's only 34 minutes or 8 minutes. I'll just do that. So I found that really inspiring. I mean, I think the thing is that TED hands the mic to the right people, and that's half the battle, really. So TED all the way.
Totally agree. I've been a big fan of TED actually since the very early days. Sort of small anecdote, but we both worked at a place called Future Publishing, and the founder of Future is Chris Anderson, who is the curator of TED. I can't remember what his title is, but he basically runs TED. And since those very, very early days when it was started life before as just a conference, which was very, very exclusive, you had to pay £3,000 or £4,000 and it was invite only, and you'd be there and you would basically have access to these amazing thinkers and talkers, and you'd spend 3 days there and your mind would just grow.
Yep.
And then he took it to a next level with this whole concept of ideas worth sharing, and suddenly going, you know what, we're going to give all of these talks away for free.
Yes.
He then decided to allow people to organize their own TED conferences, the TEDx platform, where they give all the tools, and then people can do TEDx Youth or TEDx Bristol or whatever. So phenomenal visionary in understanding that ideas and sharing ideas is a great way to see the change that you want to see. TED has got so much right in terms of trying to make the world a better place. And to bring it back to podcasts, if you just want to listen to the podcast that can make a big difference to you, then this is a great place to start. Some of my favorite TED episodes were I think one was called The Source of Creativity. The other one was Changing Cities or something like that, which was fascinating to think of how cities are changing, which needs to be revisited post-pandemic. And, there's a lot of talks about better health, how our brains work, all of these absolutely phenomenal.
So good. Speaking of phenomenal, though, up next, I had a lovely conversation with the co-host of the Global GoalsCast, Edie Lush. Now, Edie is one of those amazing people, again, that does multiple things. So she's a communications trainer, she's a speaker, she's a journalist, and she's a podcast producer. So she's really making a difference with Global GoalsCast. Here's our chat.
Welcome to the Global GoalsCast,
the podcast that explores how we can change the world. In this episode, the vaccine rollout is a moral catastrophe.
Are we vaccinating the wrong people in the wrong places? Are we potentially making this pandemic even worse?
Vaccinating all the adults in the US or the UK before we have even vaccinated healthcare workers in Africa is bad health policy and wildly unfair.
Health officials say that no one is safe until everyone is safe, but the high-income world isn't acting like they really believe it.
Not at all. In fact, the opposite.
Welcome to Podworld, Edie.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a delight.
It's funny, the type of podcasts that I normally listen to, I listen to a terrible amount of true crime podcasts, Edie. Too much true crime.
I know, because I've been listening to Podworld and I've been listening to your recommendations and then going and listening again. So I know that you like true crime, which is great because
binging more.
I mean, it's great because you've actually taught me about some true crime. So thank you.
That's what I'm about to say. Thank you, because I've been listening to the Global GoalsCast and a lot of other different podcasts that basically are all about making the world a better place. And I really think I now need to include your podcast and everyone like yours into my listening, because I genuinely feel like my brain has grown about 3 sizes since I started listening. But before we get into the Global GoalsCast, can you tell me a little bit about your background and how you got here, really?
Sure. So I'm originally from California. I moved to the UK over 20 years ago now. I can't quite believe that. I originally came as a political analyst. I worked for an investment bank. It was called Swiss Bank when I joined. It was UBS when I left. I then went to Bloomberg TV and covered politics and economics. And I went and wrote for The Week magazine. I wrote for Spectator Business. I always had a real interest in technology and entrepreneurs and using technology for good. Those words didn't really have the same resonance that they did now. I think we kind of invented these words like impact and purpose. But at the time, it was just, how technology made things better for people. So that's what I ended up focusing on. When my kids were small, I had 3 kids in pretty fast succession. So when they were small, I did things like I organized debates for Intelligence Squared. I organized a green festival on climate change. So I got into this area of sustainability really just in a roundabout way, but it has become a huge part of what I do. And so I still do a lot of journalism. I have the podcast. I also do a lot of interviews, a lot of emceeing, and a lot of those MC jobs tend to be around technology for good or things around sustainability or companies that are embracing purpose, that kind of thing. And then I also do communication training, and that is to help other people open their mouths. So, and a lot of the people I tend to work with are women. So the podcast has a real focus on women. I love focusing and working with women.
You and Claudia Romo Edelman, you're a bit of a force of nature when you're combined. In every intro that I've listened to, you're just this powerful force. How did you meet, and did you suddenly just decide to make a podcast together?
Pretty much, yeah. We actually met in Davos at the World Economic Forum, and we met at Hub Culture. So I am executive editor of a group called Hub Culture. We set up events and event spaces in kind of important moments in time, and Davos and the World Economic Forum is one of those. And I interviewed Claudia, and in fact, Stan Stalnaker, who's the head of Hub Culture, the founder, said, you guys should do a podcast, and you guys should do a podcast about the global goals. So in fact, this thing that we've created together wasn't even our idea. But Hub Culture incubated the podcast to begin with. Claudia then started a foundation called We Are All Human, which now holds it. The whole idea of the podcast, and I think why it's worked so well, is because we've become great friends, and it has been, such a joy. I think, as you probably know with DMR, you have to get along with your co-host, and you have to have some kind of, a relationship that works, and that comes across over just the audio part. And I listen to you guys, and I know that you guys have something in common. You like to talk to each other. It's interesting. And I think that's so important in a podcast. You just have to feel that chemistry between you. And we've recorded in some really bizarre places. I mean, I've been in a hotel room in Riyadh, and she's been in Mexico in a small apartment next to the hospital where her mom was staying. We've been in the closet in a hotel in Cannes.
It's the quest for audio dampening, isn't it? Yeah. I think my worst one for that is I was on the toilet in a small bathroom under a duvet, so I completely relate to sitting in a cupboard. So people might not know what the global goals are. I'd heard briefly what the global goals are. I know a lot more about them. Could you give us a sort of roundup of what they are, really?
The Sustainable Development Goals are a framework for the future of people and the planet. They are a roll-on from the Millennium Development Goals. We won't get too geeky, but those were a first set of goals that were set by leaders of how the world should be by 2015. Made some of them, didn't make all of them. And so then there was a much more ambitious plan, and 193 nations signed these into being in 2015. There's 17 goals that need to be achieved by 2030 to ensure we have a safe, prosperous, and sustainable world. Really, that's what they are. So I like to call them the world's to-do list. And if we were talking a year ago, I would have said, do you know what? We have made incredible progress. Access to electricity, girls' access to education, the number of people living in extreme poverty, the number of deaths from natural disasters. Actually, we've seen good news on every single front. And the global goals, they're the framework that's been put into place to help this progress continue. Today, if you were to ask me, how to describe them, I would still point to the progress we've seen, but also note the unbelievable setbacks we've had in the past year. Mental health, domestic violence, global health, what's happened with the environment, climate change, and what the global goals do is they give us the stepping stones to reverse what we've lost. And a lot of people refer to them as the UN's global goals. And I quite often stop people because I say, well, they were created with the United Nations. They are promoted by the United Nations, but they aren't the UN's list. They're actually your list. They're the measuring stick that you can hold up to your government because your government signed these goals. And other people can hold them up to you. As an individual, as a company, as a leader, because when you look at them, who doesn't agree with them? Let's educate everyone. Let's get everyone who can meaningful work. Let's make cities livable, circular. They are incredible goals to work towards, and I think that's why they're so powerful. It's because they're so inclusive.
Yeah, you look at that list and you say no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being. These are all things that you think, yes, these are perfect things. And I suppose for you, in terms of the podcast, that's not just, one episode a goal. These are huge issues that you can really sort of dig down into. When you started, did it feel like you started sort of uncovering more and more things to do? How did it unravel and sort of progress into what it is today?
Yeah, the goals are not small, right? Like educating everyone, eradicate extreme poverty, not small or easy goals. They're complex. They can't be described in 140 characters or even 250, whatever it is on Twitter now. There's 17 goals. There's 169 targets. There's 230 individual indicators to monitor the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And actually, every year, every country has to come to the UN and talk about their progress on the goals. But that is not an interesting podcast. that would bore everyone, right? But the point is to tell the stories of the champions who are achieving those global goals. And people you've heard of, right? Like Annie Lennox, was super exciting to interview her, but also so many people that I had never heard of. And to find some of those people, what was incredible was that we have partnered with the United Nations, with UN agencies like UNICEF, the World Food Program, the UN Foundation, as well as some incredible NGOs like One Young World, Mercy Corps, Project Everyone. And they bring us people who they think will illustrate whatever issue it is that we want to talk about. So, one story we told was of Robert and Barney Swan. They went to the South Pole relying solely on renewable energy. And Robert is actually the first person to go to the North and the South Pole. So he has a particular historical importance. And then his son, Barney, went to the South Pole. Robert was going with him because of the ice, because of climate change. Actually, Robert didn't make it. So not only were we able to tell that story of what climate change is doing to the poles, but it also, through the stories from our partners, allowed us to explore these other issues, like how the warming waters are affecting the people who fish lobster in Maine. They're losing their livelihoods. And then we also explored people's stories from the Solomon Islands, and they're losing their homes. So as a podcaster, as a journalist, it's always super important to tell a story. And I remember when we were setting up the podcast, I got so sick of people telling me, you have to really tell stories. I thought, okay, I get it. Just give me some stories to tell. But actually, the people we've met along the way, were, have been incredible.
We've talked about it a lot on Podworld about how podcasts are so transportative and they give us stories and people that we would never have heard before. But I imagine it's also very difficult in the fact that you're talking about people who have lost their livelihoods, all because of this enormous force of climate change. I feel like you're also very positive. So is it sometimes quite challenging to deliver the right balance and the right tone that's not doing anyone a disservice?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of issues that you mentioned there. The one thing is about this idea of voices we'd never normally hear. And I know I read one time this phrase, giving voice to the voiceless. And that's actually not quite right, because people have these voices. It's just that I don't hear them, right? So in a way, it's like democratizing what comes into my awareness, giving more voice to people who truly deserve it. And they deserve it because they illustrate the really big, hard issues. So we like to tell positive stories because we know that a positive story will help to change your mind and to inspire you to action. But we're not afraid to shy away where there isn't enough action being taken, where things aren't going fast enough. And one of the things we love to do is really creep into those areas that are really controversial. There was a UN report on migration, and it was on irregular migration, which you read it and you think, okay, what is this going to be? I'm already bored because it's got hard facts, blah-de-blah. In fact, it wasn't boring at all. The UN had done this incredible job. They'd interviewed 2,000 people who'd come from Africa to Europe. But that concept of irregular migration is a little bit fuzzy because it's not refugees. It really means people who come without documents, without legal permission to enter the countries that they're trying to get to. And one of the folks that I interviewed for that was the author of the report, one of the authors of the report, a guy called Mohammed Yahya from UNDP. And he told me just an incredible thing, that if you go to a lot of African capitals, you might hear people saying, well, if people knew how hard it was and how risky it was, they wouldn't leave. But actually, what they found in this report was that of over 90% of those people who migrated, only 2% who got to where they got to somewhere in Europe, knowing what they knew when they got there, would not have done that journey. So the other thing that came out of that report was that it's not people without jobs. It's not people without education. What it really is about people who aren't quite happy with their status quo, right? They have gotten a taste of something that could be better, and they just want to make their lives better. So this is not the migration of the persecuted, of the people affected by war. It's a slightly different picture. And, one of the people that I found to illustrate this story was a young man called Ibrahim Condé, who left his home in Sierra Leone. He was in school, he was being educated. He had gone home to see his mother, and he was kidnapped, I guess is the right word, by a secret society. And it was a secret society that his father had been a member of, and they wanted to brand him on his back. And he didn't want to do that. He had no interest in doing that, and he ran away. And he had nothing on him. He just ran away. And he became one of these migrants, one of the great flow of people that have been pulled towards Europe. He 2 or 3 times along the way is enslaved. He's one of those people on those boats across the Mediterranean. He loses his best friend in one of those boats. And he ends up in Italy, and then he works again for literally next to no money, enough to buy a mobile phone. And through that mobile phone, then his life starts to change for the better. He downloads Duolingo. He starts to learn Italian. And more than that, he gets access to an SMS, a text message service that helps connect him with immigration lawyers. This is a service provided by UNDP. They also have a Facebook messaging service. Through that connection to immigration lawyers, and also through winning a poetry competition, he becomes a student at an amazing private school in Italy, and he is about to finish his IB. And it's an incredible story and it illustrates, I think, one of the hardest issues to get our heads around, which is that immigration and migration is ancient, it's unstoppable, and it's positive, but only if it's done in a controlled way. And we as a world have not figured out how to do it in a controlled way that works both for the host country and for those countries where people are coming from. And so that's not an issue that you could describe in a Facebook story, and it's kind of hard to tell in an article too. But in a podcast, and I did a 2-part podcast episode about it, it was extraordinary and allowed us to have voices from the UN, from UNDP, from the people who'd invented this app, and tell his story. And he's such a compelling guy, and I still look him up on Instagram, and it's incredible to see how his life it hangs so closely in the balance, whether he'll be allowed to stay in Italy and help make Europe a better place, or whether he'll be sent back to Sierra Leone, where life will be a lot tougher.
Wow. I mean, and that's only 2 of your many, many episodes of many, many people, and that's what's really incredible. Well, on a different note, what do you, when you're maybe thinking, I want to not think about work, I don't want to think about this, I want to relax a little bit, do you have podcasts that you enjoy listening to just to get away and maybe not think about work?
Besides Podworld, you mean? and my new discoveries? Besides Podworld. So I became an avid listener to The Daily, which is the New York Times podcast. I subscribed to the New York Times the day that Trump got elected, and I remain a subscriber, and I still listen to The Daily because it connects me with the other half of my identity, which is being an American. I love Radiolab. I love Ear Hustle. Do you know Ear Hustle?
I haven't listened, no.
Made by prisoners and actually folks who've come out of prison from San Quentin in San Francisco. And I was an enormous fan of Reply All, and it's just come off the airwaves. They've had I guess a scandal is the way you'd put it. That was the podcast that got me into podcasts. I remember sitting on a tube. It was dark, February. It was raining outside. I thought, if I have to do one more Jan Feb in this country, I don't know if I can make it. And I put in the earphones and sat on the tube. And by the end of that journey, I was laughing so hard I was crying. And that's when I thought, okay, I get it. I understand podcasts. Now, how can I do more?
Yeah, I love that. I love that moment of this is what podcasts can do. I think I maybe mentioned it on the true crime episode, but there's an episode of My Favorite Murder that I listened to on a plane that literally made me want to explode with laughter. I had tears rolling down my face, and I was obviously surrounded by strangers, and that's the kind of thing that podcasts can really do.
Totally.
So, is there anything that you've done, that you've worked on over the last couple of years that you're especially proud of?
One of the things we do in every episode is we give our listeners 3 facts that they can take away and look smart in front of their mother-in-law with, and 3 actions they can take. And with our episodes on the swans who traveled to the South Pole relying on renewable energy, one of the actions we gave at the end was, if you want to do more about climate change, if you're interested in these issues, you can apply to be a part of their next journey to the North Pole. And we found out about a guy who had discovered our podcast just from his phone, who was listening to that episode sitting on the edge of his hospital bed. He had just been diagnosed with MS, and his doctor had just said, if there's anything you want to do that is going to be super active in a cold place, now's the time to do it, because cold is not going to be your friend, and activity, you may not be able to do anything super active in a couple years. And he decided there and then to apply to the Swans program. He got in, he went to the North Pole, and he totally changed his life. His name's Jason Hallmark, and I'm still in touch with him. He started an NGO to help other people with disabilities engage with the climate crisis. And I still get chills thinking about how something that I recorded that I just truly loved could help change somebody else's life.
So I could keep asking you questions, but I'm not going to. The last question I'm going to ask you is where people can find out more about you and the Global Goals Cast.
So I am on any social media channel that you might care to find, or your least hated social media channel, as at Edie Lush, EDIELUSH. And Global Goals Cast is exactly the same, at Global Goals Cast. And you can listen to us wherever you get your podcasts.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining me. It's been so lovely to chat.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and it's really allowed me to get into Podworld as well, which I've truly enjoyed. Thank you.
So in this last section of the show, we bring together all the extra podcasts that we discovered on our way through making our brains bigger, and we share these with you. And on top of that, we also bring you some listener recommendations, thus ensuring that you leave this podcast with ears full of podcasts and shows that you should listen to.
So I'm going to be honest, DMR. Normally at this section, I have like 4 podcasts that I rush through, but I've just spent a long time listening to TED. So I've been on TED Edu, which is all the education, TED Health, which is health-based. And now I've been listening to the TEDx Shorts, which is even better than the normal TED daily ones because they're only like 5 or 6 minutes long. So you can literally listen to it while you make your coffee in the morning, which is actually really nice. Like this morning, I listened to a 7-minute piece on how vaccine fear or vaccine hesitancy is not new. People have been afraid of vaccines for a long time. So they're basically doing this interesting thing where they're kind of repackaging TED Talks because they're still relevant now, because we still have the same problems that we did 5-10 years ago, and people had answers then, so people can kind of talk about them now. So that was really interesting. So I'm sorry that I've just got TED, but another one that I listened to, which is not TED related, is called Warm Regards, which I think is the best title of all times, the best pun, because it's about living on a planet that's gradually getting hotter because of carbon emissions. So it's presented by Jacqueline Gill, who is, let me make sure I get this right, she's a paleoecologist at the University of Maine, and Ramesh Lowangani, who is a biologist at Doane University. Now, I listened to this amazing episode, which was all about, instead of just talking about the science. Instead of talking about the science, it was talking about how storytelling can really change our idea of climate futures. And in that, I discovered that Jacqueline is a gamer, which is really exciting. So I'm totally into that. But it was it's a really interesting podcast, again, that brings in really bright, smart people to talk about the problems, sort of writers and authors and people doing interesting research. And they're having really sort of fascinating conversations. So I really enjoyed that. And I think what you were saying at the start about things sounding a bit grim and how it could just sound really depressing. These are people who are saying, yes, these things are grim, but look at all this research and work that's being done so that this doesn't happen. So I did feel super positive about it, even though it's literally about a planet that's heating up.
Yeah, which we kind of have to face that fact, right?
We do, yeah.
And this whole thing about searching for podcasts that try to make the world a better place was really interesting, because a lot of it does revolve around the biggest challenge we have as a population from a climate change point of view. And it did involve a lot of scientists and things like that. But listeners, don't think that this makes it dry and actually dull. Because to some people, their last interaction with science was at school and they hated it. This is not what it's about. The best ones bring all of those facts and those people to life, and they tell stories, and it is inspirational. And they also give you practical things that you can do. So this first extra that I have is called Green Dreamer, and it's really refreshing podcast. It's by Kamia Chain. And she interviews a guest in every episode, and they're usually inspiring people who help tackle the climate crisis. What I love about this is, yes, the conversation interviews actually are really interesting, but she summarizes, she kind of does a TLDR at the end of the episode, and gives you 5 takeaways. And some are big, but some are very, very small and totally within reach. My next one is called The Received Wisdom. So we're big brain stuff here. So this is a podcast hosted by Dr. Shobita Parthasarathi, who's a professor of public policy at the University of Michigan, and Dr. Jack Stilgo, who's a senior lecturer at the University College London. And they tackle really big questions like, are robots racists? Or should we regulate gene editing? And they talk to thinkers and doers from around the world. And the big thing is they challenge the perceived wisdom that science and tech always makes the world a better place. And that's what's really interesting, because you've got scientists challenging the fact that science, the perceived wisdom is that science always makes the world a better place, because it doesn't always. Love this podcast because it really has made me think. But I would say I can't really be doing much else when I listen to this, because I really have to be on my A game. I have to be concentrating.
Yep.
But it is a really, really powerful podcast. And then my final one is actually quite different. It's called Conversations with People Who Hate Me. I don't know if you've heard of this one, Lou, but
I haven't.
I picked it up because it confronts something that I think is making the world a worse place, which is the online vitriol and anger and trolling and disparaging comments that people who put themselves out there online are often subject to. And the host of this podcast is called Dylan Marin, and he connects people who have been clashing online. So sometimes it's old friends who are having a feud about something, or it could be complete strangers who are just angrily going at each other online. And despite that, the show's actually really positive, because whether Dylan is confronting someone who wrote him a horrific comment, and he calls them up, he's literally on the phone calling them up, or he sometimes moderates a call between 2 strangers who have never met but who are having a to-do online. The results are always really, really surprising. It kind of makes you realize that once people click and they realize themselves that they're talking to other people, they're not just behind a keyboard, behind a screen, hiding, that it's actually human to human, they the humanity actually comes out, and they suddenly either apologize or they might stand by the criticism they were making, but they will make it in a very different way from a tonality point of view. And rather than calling somebody names, I'll actually go, well, I don't agree with your position, your political position, but I totally respect that you made it. And it changes the whole discourse.
I bet.
And it's the only sad thing about this podcast is it hasn't had any new episodes for the last 12 months, but there's a stack of 40 something episodes, which actually are totally valid today. So it's not because it's no longer active that it's not valid. And if you're somebody who, like me, often looks at comments online and actions online and a little bit disheartened about the human race, then actually this will give you a lot of hope.
I really like that concept. It always initially, the idea of that phone conversation initially, though, I get serious like cringe and social awkwardness. So that would really,
me too.
That would be a serious challenge for me to listen to those people apologise to each other, which they should be apologising to each other because, yes, online discourse is quite often tragic. I remember a really interesting, the comedian Sarah Silverman. She's really, she's been subject to quite a lot of hate and vitriol over the years for various reasons. But one guy was particularly nasty and she replied to him and they ended up having a chat and he apologized. And it's because he was having terrible problems with his spine and he was constantly in pain and couldn't get health cover. And there was all these things, it turned out, and they ended up having a really human conversation. But had she not engaged, he would have just been another troll, which he was being. But obviously nobody is. Everybody is a human on the end of it. So I think that's really interesting. So now it's the part of the show where we ask for listener recommendations, but we thought, rather than reading out your recommendations, that we would pass the microphone to you. So if you want to recommend a podcast, or even just tell us about your own podcast and why we should be listening to it, you can record us a voice note and we'll feature it in this next section. Just let us know what the podcast is, what it's about, and why we should be listening to it. So send your voice note or recording to hello@podworld.fm. That's hello@podworld.fm. Here's what you recommend this time.
Hey Podworld, I'm Ala, and along with my friend Ajwa, I co-host the Planet Policy Pals podcast. It's a really fun time for us getting to investigate environmental policies from around the world, and since we're such big science nerds, we love connecting the science, technology community with the policy community and looking at how laws are working for communities. We get to compare places like America to places like Korea, which is a really fun time. We love doing it.
Hi Podworld. The podcast I'd like to recommend for your show is the Lex Friedman podcast. It covers a very diverse range of subject matter, from tech to philosophy to economics. The thing I love about it is the quality of the guests and how the episodes are really long, some even excess of 2 hours. So they tend to really deep dive into subject matter and end up running thought experiments because there's no time limit on each episode. Lex himself is a very humble show host and is always open to having his mind changed, which is great because the exploration of subject matter has more integrity to it than I tend to see on many other shows. Don't always agree with everything I hear on it, but love some of the radical ideas and questions posed. Really great content, and I hope you guys enjoy it as much as I do.
Hi Podworld, I'm Elaine, and I wanted to let you know about a podcast I've been listening to for quite a few years now. It's called By the Book, and it describes itself as half reality show and half self-help podcast. I'm a bit of a sucker for self-help books, but also cynical about which of them are actually worth reading. By the Book is the Podworld of self-help books in that it helps you sort the wheat from the chaff. Listening to Jolenta and Kristen is like being at a dinner party with your friends, and each episode they live by the rules of a self-help book and let you know which ones live up to the hype, often with unexpected and humorous consequences. It's not highbrow, but it is fun.
Is that it? That's pretty much what... Is that it? Is that it? Have we changed the world?
Maybe. One podcast at a time.
One podcast at a time. So next episode, I think we've got something quite different, haven't we, Lou?
Yeah, we do. So next episode, it's time to do that thing where, you know, when you go shopping hungry and you end up buying all of the delicious, delicious foods that you don't actually need, That's going to be our podcast next time. So we're munching through our body weight in food-related podcasts. We've also got an interview with Cynthia Graber and Nikki Twilley, the host of Gastropod, which is a podcast that mixes food, science, and history. Yum.
And don't forget to get in touch with us. We're Podworld on Twitter and Instagram, or you can go to our website, podworld.fm, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Podworld is produced, edited and hosted by Louise Blaine and David Marr Roberts, otherwise known as DMR, with design and graphics from Dylan Channon and the research by LMR Roberts. The theme music was composed by Dan Phillipson. We'd like to say a big thank you to the team at Dialect for their never-ending support.